Okay, we are recording. I'm going to share my screen. All right. And here we go. The right place at the right time. That is a phrase that we've heard a lot. I'm sure many of us have said it at different times. The question I have is, does anybody have an example? Anybody have an example of being in the right place at the right time?
I was at lunch bunch.
What was that?
Ben says he was at lunch bunch, which was where the girl gave him my name.
I got you.
That's the way we met, was he met her at lunch bunch, he got my name, and it ended up with us getting together.
Right place at the right time.
Thomas, that's the same thing I was thinking about when I was at Atlantic Beach one day many years ago and met a certain sweet young lady that I'm still with.
50 years later.
Yeah.
50 years later.
The right place at the right time.
That's awesome. Any others?
Me getting the job at Andrew Baptist Church.
Yes.
We agree.
I mean, everything lined up for that perfectly. So that was a good one for me.
It was a very good one for all of us. There's no doubt about it.
And we didn't run her off.
Yeah, KP?
Right. This is Katie. Yeah. Actually, I think the right time and the right place was when Mark and I moved from Fredericksburg, Virginia to North Carolina in April 1st. We moved to a new house in Willow Spring and realized that Andrew Baptist Church was less than 15 minutes from our house, and it just everything kind of just came together. We just started an entire new chapter in our lives, and it really was the right time at the right place. Earlier wouldn't have been good. Later, who knows what would have happened. We just have to be divine providence that everything happened the way it did.
That's great. And we're grateful for that divine providence there as well. Any other examples? All right. Well, we can chalk these up to lots of different things, right? We can chalk them up to luck. We can chalk them up just to being fortunate. We can chalk them up to being blessed. And a lot of these things, right place at the right time, it was God intervening. I do want to put all three of these up here, though, because sometimes, I do believe God is in the little details of our lives. I do also think we can get off track a little bit if we say, well, everything that works out, God just ordained that and everything is just perfect. I want to give you a quick story. I was driving, and I may have told y'all this story, so you can stop me if I have. But I think I have. But anyways, I'll tell the quick version. Driving to school, and I was late, but I decided I was going to do my devotion anyway. Well, before I left the house, I didn't do my devotion while I was driving. Let me back up there. I was running late, and I decided before I left the house, I was going to do my devotion, and I caught every green light on the way to school. The next morning, I was running behind, and I said, I'm still going to do my devotion, and I hit every red light. It was right place at the right time. It was divine intervention. Everything was perfect. But if you're not careful, that divine intervention, everything, God working everything out for me according to the way that I want it to work out, is a very dangerous proposition. Now, big things like meeting spouses, like God opening up job opportunities, or like you talked about, KP, God working out all these details for you to be a part of Andrew Baptist. I think there are a whole lot of big things that God is in and behind and in and through. Just a reminder not to just chalk everything up to God. Just worked it all out just for me, and he just took care of all of it, because he becomes a genie in a bottle pretty quick if we're not careful on that front. But right place at the right time. Joseph was certainly in the right place at the right time, even though that place he finds himself in at the beginning of chapter 41 is prison. So that's such an interesting thing. I did not put it up, so if you have your Bibles, you can turn to Genesis 41. I am going to read verses 1 through 13, and then we're going to talk about it a little bit. I said I did not put it up. I'm gonna pull it up real quick. Genesis 41. All right. Okay. Starting at verse 1, and we'll go through verse 13. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled. So he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And the things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Okay, so a whole lot going on in this passage here. But of course, and we mentioned this last week, but it was 2 full years later. I cannot imagine what was going through Joseph's mind with this, and yet he persevered. And to me, that's one of the most important lessons that Joseph teaches us in this part. Life is difficult, and of course, Joseph knew that, but he still had faith. He still persevered, and he continued to look for what God was doing in his life. And I don't think there's ever a point in our life where we don't need to hear this message, right? Like we're always having to persevere through something. And I think that is a powerful message for us here. But there's, again, 2 dreams. Joseph had his 2 dreams. The cupbearer and the chief baker had their 2 dreams. And now Pharaoh has his 2 dreams. 7 cows coming from the Nile. Well, why was the Nile so important?
That was their livelihood, right?
It was their livelihood. That's exactly right. I'm going to see if I can pick Wayne Oakes' brain for a minute. Wayne, why was the Nile so important? And obviously the river and the water and that sort of thing, but what was so special about the Nile? Why was it such a fertile delta and that sort of thing? Oh, do you remember? Did I put you on the
I don't remember.
Oh, I put you on the spot, Wayne. I'm sorry. So the Nile would always flood, right? And so that flooding, all that silt and all that stuff from the bottom of the river would make the surrounding delta just an incredibly fertile land. And so crops just exploded, and it was just an incredible just an incredible lifeline for all the Egyptians. So the 7 cows coming from the Nile, and they look beautiful. And then there's these 7 heads of grain, and we'll get into the interpretation here in just a little bit. But then the 7 heads of grain, there again talking about abundance, and 7 talking about 7 years, and those sort of things. But Pharaoh was troubled by the dream, and nobody was able to interpret the dreams. No one was there that could tell the Pharaoh exactly what was going on here. But there's something else that I wanted to talk to here in these first 13 verses. The cupbearer had a choice. There's this, he's at a very big crossroads in his life. He could continue to forget Joseph and let Pharaoh stay troubled and upset. Or he could remind Pharaoh of his imprisonment and say, hey, don't you remember when you threw me in jail? And there was this guy that I met there. And we talked about this a little bit right at the end last week. But just looking at those 2 things, why would he not forget Joseph? I mean, what could possibly go wrong by just staying silent? Any thoughts there?
You don't want the big guy in a bad mood all the time, because then that causes problems for the little people.
That's exactly right. I think of King Nebuchadnezzar when he had his dream and nobody could interpret it. Remember Daniel in the book of Daniel, and he says, look, I'm going to kill all the wise men because nobody can tell me what my dream means. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar didn't even tell him what the dream was. He just said, you have to tell me what the dream was and the interpretation, which is completely impossible, of course, except for God. But the cupbearer does evidently, that was the only thing I could come up there with, Michelle, was that there must have been some fear that if he is this troubled, if he's in this bad mood, it's going to be bad for the rest of us here. And I'd never really noticed verse 9 before, but the commentary pulled this out. I want to read verse 9 for you again. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I am reminded of my shortcomings. The NRSV says, I remember my faults today. He's saying, look, I remember my sins. And he's shining a spotlight on his sins here and his shortcomings by doing this. And I think that's a pretty, a pretty incredible thing there. We obviously don't like to shine the spotlight on our sins and our problems and our shortcomings, but this is an incredible thing that that the cupbearer does here. And even as he does that, and he tells the story, remember you threw me in prison with the cheap baker and that sort of thing. I do love how he ends on a high note there in verse 13. He says, and things turn out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled or hanged. And I think it's just really ironic, right? Good storytelling to say, I messed up. I was in prison and that sort of thing, but I was restored to my position. Remember that other guy? Yeah, he was hanged. He didn't make it. Framing is important, isn't it? Anybody ever have to frame a conversation with their parents? Right? I know you're going to be upset, but just listen. And choosing, are you going to go tell this to mom or dad? And depending on what it was, you may choose one over the other. Those are big decisions and big moments. But he does say, look, I was restored. Remember, I messed up, but I was restored. And that other guy, he was the real scoundrel. And even as we're kind of joking about it a little bit, I do think it is important, especially when you have difficult conversations, thinking through the framing and how you're going to deliver the message is important. I had a mentor that's, just, said, if you ever have to deliver a message to somebody, you write the positive and you say the negative. So if you have to deliver a difficult message, and if it's negative, go ahead and call them on the phone, or better yet, meet them for lunch. Of course, we can't do that right now, but the idea is it's so much better to hear the voice of the negative, because if you write it, boy, those words are etched in stone, and they read over them, and then they read intent in them, and then they figure out exactly what you meant. And I had somebody tell me one time, you can't read tone in an email, and I'm like, well, you can make it up. That's, but you write the positive, because then that positive word is just constantly there, and you can go back and look at that positive word, and it just kind of keeps getting better and better, and the negative word does the same thing, and that sort of thing. But I think that framing, like I said, is an important thing. We'll stop there for just a second. Any thoughts or comments there before we go on?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, clearly we've heard about it a couple of times, but back in the day, was dream interpretations a big thing? Like now, if people talk about interpreting dreams, we just kind of chalk it up to, oh, that's interesting, or I never thought about it that way. Is this was this a real big thing?
The commentary did point out that Joseph has a special gift. Like this is a special gift of Joseph's. I don't think it was definitely more common then than it is now. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the spiritual just had such a different realm in, up until the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, and, and all of these, relatively young ideas that we have before the Scientific Revolution, where we can explain everything, or seemingly explain everything. We understand the physical world, so we don't have nearly as much room for the spiritual. But the spiritual world, I don't know, it played a bigger daily factor in their lives than it does in modern life, because of that, because of our science and our need to explain everything. We dismiss things, right? Ghosts might be real or might not be real, but we're not even gonna think about that. We're gonna put that in a box, and we're just gonna kind of leave it over here. But the spiritual world was and their familiarity with death as well. They were so much more accustomed, even back in the turn of the century, than we are now. It was just, we have kind of grown protected to those things. Other thoughts there, or any other things to point out there? All right. Well, let's continue on into chapter 41, verses 14 through 16. Let's come back over here. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. So a whole lot here as well, but we have Joseph's elevation. And I want you to hear the elevation. Obviously, he's being elevated in power and situation, but also physically he's being elevated. Joseph was brought from the dungeon. And in many ways, he has never really gotten out of the pit that his brothers threw him in. And this is his opportunity for Pharaoh himself to bring him out of the dungeon and change his physical location. And then shaved and changed his clothes. Once again, a sign of his elevation and his status. He's a new man. And his prominence and his power is just growing, and his freedom is finally being experienced. His whole life has been changed by this. And then another important part of this is his insistence that this belongs to God. Obviously, Joseph, as a young man, it was all about him and how great he was and how everybody was going to bow down to him and how he was the best thing since sliced bread. And it was all about Joseph. And here, we don't have a prideful man. He says, I cannot do it. Now, imagine telling the king you can't do it, right? I mean, I don't want to admit to anybody that I can't do it unless I really know, like, man, there's no way I have an opportunity to do it. I still want to try to figure it out. But I mean, he had already shown a capacity for dream interpretation, and yet he still gave God all the credit. And later on there in verse 25, he mentions that God has shown you, Pharaoh, what's about to happen. So as Joseph is being elevated, he is humbling himself, and God is lifting him through all of these different circumstances. So I think that's just a pretty incredible part of the story here. And then God will give him the answer that he desires. And I didn't know until I looked at the commentary that when he says there, God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires, that Hebrew word is the word shalom, the word for peace. Remember, Pharaoh was troubled by these dreams. And he says, look, God's going to give you the peace that you need with the interpretation of the dream. And that's even before Joseph has heard the dream. And that's just a pretty incredible little nugget there that's how much faith Joseph has that God will bring peace into this situation. And I just think it's just really, really incredible. Pause there for just a second. Any other thoughts there?
I just think that really got lost in our interpretation of it, because telling somebody what they want to hear and versus giving them a piece about what they will be hearing, to me, are two different things. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm glad that you brought up the term shalom and that was actually the translation, because I think it means two different things.
Absolutely. And you talk about the pressure of telling people what they want to hear. We have that pressure, don't we, with our friends? I mean, we call up our friends and we know that we're right about something. And we're like, don't you think? I'm right, and it's hard to be like, I don't know. I think you got off in turn 3 there. You took a right instead of a left, NASCAR. It's hard. It's really hard with our friends, let alone with a king that can take your head off, and yet you're right there, Lolita, the fact that he believes that this will bring shalom, this will bring peace.
Does the Hebrew say shalom?
Yes.
Or is it an interpretation?
No, it is shalom. That is the word there. Shalom. According to the commentary, I did not read the Hebrew. My Hebrew is dusty there, so I'm depending on the commentary there.
Yeah, the New American Standard says, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer."
That's right. Yeah. So the NIV says the answer he desires. And the NRSV, A favorable answer is what NRSV says as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, when the commentary pulled that out, I said, well, that is a neat interpretation of that, because you usually just think of peace with shalom. Other thoughts there?
Thomas, I was just thinking about the answer he desires, the translation where maybe Pharaoh did not have a specific answer in mind that he wanted to hear. I think I feel like he should know the answer. He wanted an interpretation. He wanted an answer, so that God will give you the answer that you want. Not the answer you're thinking of, but just the answer.
That's right.
Is that possible?
I think that's definitely possible. And I think that's where it gets to that peace there. It's like you have the peace of mind that you may not like the answer that somebody gives you, but hearing them say it, at least you have a peace about where they are and what they're saying. And you know, I may not like it, but at least the question is gone. The question is answered.
Kind of like the fear of the unknown.
Yes, yes.
You know, a tumor, a biopsy, I want to know, good or bad, I just need to know, kind of thing, right?
You're exactly right there, Chuck. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Other thoughts there? Great discussion, y'all. All right. And then going on to verse 17, we're not going to read it. He does retell the dreams. The biggest difference between the retelling and the first part that we already read, he tells it in the first person because he's telling it to Joseph. And then he anticipates the negative interpretation. You can feel the tension as he's retelling it. He's like, and I didn't understand what was happening. And there's just, I was trying to look, but you just feel it as he reads this, as verses 17 through 24 in those verses there. So I did just want to touch on that we're going to skip that section so that we can don't have to read the same part over again. But those are the biggest differences there. Okay. Let's keep on going there. Then comes to the interpretations. Of course, this is a story that we've heard many times, and we've heard the interpretation, and we know that there's going to be 7 years of feast and then 7 years of famine that are so bad they're going to swallow up the years of feast, and so much so that people will forget how good it was. It doesn't take us long to forget how good times were, right? It can rain every day. I remember, I feel like it was last year, it rained, after Hurricane Florence, it rained every week through the winter. And then, it was clockwork. And then all of a sudden, the farmers in Roland got their corn in the ground, and we didn't have a drop, all right? And it was like, well, but we get into the summer, and it's like, we need rain, and it's so dry, and it was. But I'm sitting there going, but we were praying for it to stop raining in January because we couldn't prep the fields. Obviously, that's a very, that's a life-changing thing for our farmers. But it's really easy for us to go through a bad spell and forget all the good that happened right before it. And just get consumed by the bad there. And the other important part about the interpretations is that Joseph fills in the blanks. If you look there at verse 33, he finishes the interpretation in verse 32. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. But verse 33, he goes into the advice mode. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held and reserved for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt. And I love how Joseph immediately goes into this idea of, hey, look, this is coming, and what you need to do is you need to store up this grain. And boy, Pharaoh says, man, this is a good deal. Store up the grain. And then the blessings start to come for Joseph. And remember, Joseph has been waiting for these blessings for a long, long time. It starts in verses 37 through 40. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Isn't that incredible that he recognizes that the Spirit of God is in Joseph? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, verse 39, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So he puts him in second in command. From the dungeon to second in command, only below Pharaoh. But it doesn't stop there. Look at verses 42 and 43. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He gave him the checkbook. And he dressed him in robes of fine linen. Joseph knew a little bit about fine linen robes, didn't he? It put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way. That's what the NIV says. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Does anybody have a different interpretation? There, a different version of what it says there instead of make way? Does anybody have a different phrase there?
New American Standard says bow the knee.
Bow the knee. That's full circle, right? Joseph has this dream about everybody bowing down to him, and he thought it was his job to make sure everybody bowed. Now, isn't that a big, important thing for us to remember? We think we can make other people bow down to us, or that's our job to show how big we are or strong we are. And Pharaoh says, I'm going to send somebody that's going to go before you that's going to say that. And doesn't it mean so much more when somebody else says it? We can say make way, bow down to me all we want to, but boy, when somebody else says it, that's when it really resonates. All humans in some way are trying to say, make themselves important. But it's just incredible that Pharaoh has made this happen for Joseph here. And then Pharaoh's daughter, Asenath, was given to him as his wife as well. I'm going to pause there. Thoughts there before we go to our next to last slide?
Yeah, I have a question, Thomas.
Okay.
I find it kind of interesting. Sorry for all the background noise here. I find it kind of interesting that that Pharaoh, who doesn't believe in God, at least that was my understanding of the pharaohs, says to find somebody that has the Spirit of God, in whom is the Spirit of God. So I found that kind of interesting, which is neat, because